Assalamu alaikum. Welcome to the Betaya program with your host Tariq Khan. Today we'll analyze and explore the points of view on African agency through the African Continental Free Trade Area (Afcfta). It is honor for me to introduce and bring our guest Ms Arina and Ms Sanusha in our program. You are senior research fellows and analyst on African relations and strategic issues at Center for Global Dialogue associated with the University of South Africa. Ms Arina and Ms Sanusha, thank you so much for joining the program, and you are most welcome in program.
Thank you very much. Really appreciate you having us.
Thanks, Tariq. Thanks for having us.
Ms Arina, what is the African agency and where does it fit into the context of African trade? What is your analysis?
So, in terms of what is African agency and where does this fit into the context of African trade, let's start by defining what African agency is. And I mean, much emphasis is placed on what is the ability to project and leverage interests in terms of positions, common African positions. What is the access to platforms that can operate based on an international system, and also what is the historical impact of structural constraints compounding from slavery, colonialism, then liberation that followed, and the post-colonial environment. So all of this, but also allowing the core of one's philosophical and practical being to find this kind of expression. So African countries in all of this may seek to express, capacitating agency specifically through foreign and trade policies, making through bilateral and multilateral channels, and drawing from a kind of collective global south call for a fundamental rethink in what power reforms in international institutions mean. So, in a nutshell, the context of African trade fitting in this, we are seeing a world that is experiencing a rise in trade protectionism and trade wars in the recent years. And Africa, within a period of 5 years, has shown the way by negotiating a particular agreement that has a lot of technicalities involved, and an agreement that liberalizes trade and establishes a rules-based system. So they're trying to accelerate an inter-African trade, boosting Africa's trading position, eventually in the global market, but firstly by strengthening Africa's common voice in the policy space and global trade negotiations.
Sanusha, why is there interest in this particular area, and why is this important for Africa? How would you analyze this?
Tariq, the issue of economic development in Africa and the context that Arina has set out with regard to why African agency and economic development are so intertwined goes back, I think, to the post-colonial state, independence from colonial powers, but it's also about the idea of economic development, that in a way through economic transactions, you can actually deal with some of the structural transformation issues with regard to the way in which the market is organized, the way in which transactional value is defined, and also just using trade as a important driver, if not pillar, around how Africa can use it to deal with its developmental challenges. I think that's the one issue. So there is two ways in which you can answer the question around what Arina was referring to as agency. One is around the African countries coming together and providing the kind of economic leadership, the economic governance, the structure around the market, and how this represents for the second dimension, and that is the interest that this piques, not just for boosting intra-Africa trade, which is really very low. I think it's below 20%, and given the fact that most other regions like in South Asia, Southeast Asia, the Asia Pacific, Europe, and in parts of Latin America, you see intra-regional trade or intra-continental trade being much higher. Africa's is really negligible in terms of percentage, and we're not African countries are not trading with each other. So the interest is actually driven by this internal dynamic of how do you drive trade, how do you build the kind of economic integration and the economic trade dimensions that will actually facilitate greater intra-African trade. The second dimension to that is the interest this will pique for external actors, those that want to come and invest in the African market, but also those that will want to start trading in the African market. And it ties back very closely to the kind of philosophy that the World Bank and the IMF have. I mean, very much along the lines of how trade and economic development are intertwined. So it's about the interest that this piques for external actors who look at the market as an economic dividend, an economic output, linked to the very important dynamics of economic liberalization and the liberal economic model. Unfortunately, I think where we find ourselves caught in a dilemma with regard to the interest and what is the interest and how that interest is being translated into implementable action on the ground is the structural barriers that are presented to Africa having that kind of economic development based on a trade consensus and a trade-driven approach. The problem is the diversity of Africa is that its economies are quite diverse in scale and in market value as well as in terms of purchasing power. Now, we don't have a kind of standardized set of rules as well. So this is why the African Free Trade Agreement is considered to be a kind of optimum approach to trying to deal with the tariff barriers that exist in terms of rules of origin around product production, cross-border trade, when you start trading with each other, how do you deal with the instruments around rules of origin, how do you deal with the barriers around trading in terms of what we call a spaghetti bowl of economic overlap, where you have one country belonging to several regional economic communities. And very often that becomes a tariff barrier because you have the way in which tariffs are applied. So the first starting point for Africa would be to reduce those tariff barriers, and that was signed in January, and that is what is being implemented at the moment towards reducing those tariff barriers that prevent trade from happening and prevent the kind of dynamics of trade to happen. But the second challenge is to deal with many of the cross-border initiatives and challenges that exist. We don't have we don't have very good borders. We have land borders, we have porous borders where a lot of cross-border trade takes place. And so the idea is to reduce those barriers to trade. Thirdly, I think the interest is also piqued by the idea that we could deal with poverty in this way. We can trade our way out of poverty. The challenge again is for there to be consensus around key macro or key continental issues around trade. The big challenges remain that some countries remain insulated. I mean, Arina spoke about the trade issues with the global economy, the move towards economic nationalism, trade barriers, tariff protectionism. All of these things actually exist within Africa as well. It may have not happened in the way that it's unfolding or exacerbated at the global level, but it does actually pose serious threats. So, for example, if you have a trade agreement with, say, between China and South Africa, how does that impact South Africa's role in Southern Africa with other Southern African economies? Very often, these trade agreements, bilateral agreements, tend to take more precedence over regional economic arrangements and agreements. So this is where I think we're trying to look at how this free trade agreement, the Continental Free Trade Agreement, would unpack those and address these structural conditions around economic transformation. But the interest is that people are economic actors in the global economy are being enticed into this whole process because they're seeing Africa as a big consumer market. Again, we've got to be very careful in definition. We've got to be very careful in how we flag these issues and how we present these issues in the global context, because it doesn't mean that if we look at the World Bank reports and the ease of doing business and so forth, that our markets are essentially all in a kind of comparative advantage. There's a lot of uneasiness, there's a lot of disparity, fragmentation between economic instruments, between economic markets, and so forth. So our consumer base may be large because it's considered to be, the African continent is considered to be the youngest continent, the only continent where population growth is in positive terrain. But at the same time, the challenge is that you've got to look at purchasing power. And the projections done by, say, the Institute for Security Studies around the impact of COVID-19 on the economic dimension of Africa's markets, and including South Africa, economic prospects, is that we are sitting with an issue where we're not sure to what extent the impact of COVID-19 on GDP purchasing power is going to affect how much people have as purchasing power to actually transact in the market. So if there's no consumers, how are we going to get this going through? And I think that's where part of this dilemma is to unpack this African Free Trade Agreement and not to sit with it in a kind of rhetoric and a narrative where we're creating this expectation around this agreement, but when we really start looking at the implementation on the ground and the factors and the structural conditions that are driving economic development in the continent, there's a disconnect.
Arina, how would you analyze the potential for the African Continental Free Trade Area Afcfta?
What's interesting about the potential for the African Continental Free Trade Area, and we've heard the figures that have been touted. If I can just go back, when fully functional, the Continental Free Trade Area is supposed to boast a combined total of GDP US $2.1 trillion. Okay, so this is the kind of market it's supposed to be accessing, and with an African GDP growth between 1 to 3% and employment growth of 1.2%. The Afcfta is supposed to make a significant contribution to South-South trade and investment, especially at a time when multilateral institutions and globalizations are being questioned. But coming to, the expectations versus the practicalities of the Continental Free Trade Area, a number of things become a bit clearer. In terms of tariff liberalization, which is what the initial starting point is supposed to be achieving, African nations have agreed to something like 90% tariff liberalization over a 10-year period. So with the first 5 years being the transition period, countries can add an additional 7% of their trading goods as sensitive products, against which, reduction in tariffs will occur over a much longer period. And then in this context, there is another 3% of excluded goods. So a lot of this expectations is actually very relative in terms of what countries have in their diversified or diversifying, let's rather talk about hopefully further diversifying economies. So more importantly, in addition to these tariff barriers, this needs to actually be reciprocated. And it varies immensely among countries. And quantitatively, this needs to be accessed in terms of the customs and excise agreements on individual countries. So you're starting to see a very strong bilateral element of the Afcfta that needs to be implemented at a domestic level. And more importantly, by the end of June 2021, there is an expectations, that negotiations on these tariffs will be completed, and that this liberalization adjustment period where less developed countries there will be a liberalization adjustment period for many countries, specifically less developed countries, where they will be encountering challenges and market instability in certain respects. But we are also likely to see immense strides in technical infrastructure, which clarifies, the dumping of subsidized goods by wealthier countries, where barriers to trade reform on on the continent are still being challenged. So the rules of origin in this regard are immensely important. And when I talk about rules of origin, I mean the criteria that is used to define where a product was made. And this is an essential part of the international trade rules because of policies that allow countries to discriminate. And for this reason, there's a distinction between the non-preferential and preferential rules of origin. And this is yet to be defined. This is still in a process of being finalized. And another element, another potential element that the Continental Free Trade Area can even address is issues of invoicing, where, I mean, a recent United Nations Conference on Trade and Development report clearly mentions how African countries are misinvoicing at ports, and there is a total value of transaction costs, for example, of 52 billion annually that Africa is losing out on. So this is another issue. Another potential development is in your technical developments, where you are going to start implementing, a stronger verification system where goods, so that you can determine which is counterfeit as well. The amount of counterfeit medicines that find their way to Africa has been an issue since the Doha round of negotiations. And this is something that can contribute positively to African industry, specifically trading in medicines. An African representative that has been seconded to the Continental Free Trade Area, or rather, let me not say seconded, the representative from South Africa, says that, tariffs should be a tool of industrial development. And this is where, as a continent, they want to make a lot more strides, where you see trade increasing substantially, but also building on the capacity to develop industrially. So there's a lot of expectations placed on the potential of the Continental Free Trade Area.
Sanusha, how would you analyze African trade landscape framework? How would you analyze?
I think it's very important to remember that this AFCFTA is actually a combination of different frameworks around Africa's economic development model. We've had the Lagos Plan of Action, which was a kind of internal. It was a continental framework that was devised and designed to make Africa more self-reliant. It was aimed at making Africa trade more with itself and become more kind of aligned to what was comparative advantage around imports. So in other words, not being too dependent on the external market, on dependency of external products, which then makes Africa less able to build its continental value chains, but also to enhance comparative advantage in production and manufacturing. So the Lagos Plan of Action was really around the idea of enhancing and strengthening localization of products, localization of economic transactions, and so forth. But of course, the challenge is that it came at a time when Africa was caught in its debt trap. It was caught in a dependency. It was relying on, despite being a continent of immense resources, I mean, if you look at the Democratic Republic of Congo, it shouldn't actually be a country that just exports primary commodities that are then used in all of our tech products, like our laptops, our phones. It's got cobalt, it's got iron ore, it's got all kinds of minerals that are then used in the kind of value chain of production in technological development. But again, countries like the DRC, like Angola, are still only primary producers or exporters of minerals. And so the challenge with Africa was to try and create a shift away from the extractive production or the extractive industries that became key drivers of the African economic landscape. And so that was the Lagos Plan of Action was. But unfortunately, we've seen these plans of actions come and they haven't really found traction. They haven't really found their political life in terms of how they were instrumentalized in becoming a consensus approach to the way economic development needed to be unfolded in Africa. And then you had structural adjustment programs, and the structural adjustment programs were really about creating a very kind of orthodox approach to the free market system, where essentially Africa's reliance on external markets, the debt crisis, the borrowing that just completely exacerbated defaults on loans and services on loans from African countries who were unable to sustain this debt model, then had to adopt structural adjustment programs. And structural adjustment programs just completely decimated sectors in Africa. An example would be how in Mozambique, the cashew nut industry. Mozambique is quite an important producer of cashew nuts, but the cashew nut industry actually became decimated because structural adjustment programs, as directed by IMF and World Bank men in black suits, essentially came in and redirected production. So in Mozambique, the cashew nut industry was just primarily extractive, in a sense where all they did was harvested the cashew nuts and exported it in its raw form to be processed somewhere else. And this was, I think, somewhere in Asia, and then to be re-exported into Africa. Same thing with oil. If you look at Nigeria, you look at Angola, they are actually importing refined oil instead of being refiners of their own oil. And so what you had was this whole decimation of the economic structure in Africa, and the state played a very minimalist role. Then you had economic actors like the UNECA, people that were professors like Tendeke Makerere and others, who were speaking about alternative structural adjustment programs, again about self-sufficiency. And then you had the Abuja Treaty, which talked about regional economic communities and how can that build the pillar and the strength of economic integration and so forth. And so I think this is, and then of course, lastly, we now have the Agenda 2063, which has 7 visions or 7 aspirations. And all of this is about economic self-sufficiency, sustainability for development and growth, and of course for inclusive development and livelihoods of people. But again, it comes at a time when the structural conditions in the global economy seem to be at odds with each other. It's polarized. It's not having the kind of economic traction. And so Africa again finds itself on the periphery. And I think what is really challenging for us in Africa around the African Continental Free Trade Agreement is really the question of the model of the instrument and the agreement itself. It seems to me that it's built very much along the lines of an export-led growth model. Now that would work if you are able to be competitive in exports. You got to look at China and see how China became the workshop of the world, and then it evolved into the next phase of its economic development, which is now the dual circulation strategy. In Africa, I think we're still sitting in a very primary production extractive industry kind of approach to production as well as to manufacturing. So for locating the African Continental Free Trade Agreement, I think you've got to realize there was a historical period, historical processes, and this is where we are now. The challenge is that we have to think about how do we produce for ourselves and how do we produce for the global economy. And the challenge for many African countries is that they are producing on the basis of a model that is going through an existential crisis globally. This economic model of liberalization and tariff liberalization and market liberalization has been turned on its head globally. We've seen what has happened in other countries. And so the return to this in Africa means that we've got to have other incentives to take into consideration other stakeholders and actors in the African Continental Free Trade Agreement. I think if you look at it, much of this agreement is assuming that there could be regional cooperation on infrastructure, there could be turnkey projects that will be key to driving energy consumption, that will be key to have more energy infrastructure where we can have affordable energy, we can have affordable water and sanitation access and so forth. But again, this is about bringing in the big investment. We also got to recognize that one of the incentive areas for the ACFTA to do well is around the cross-border trade. cross-border trade and the movement of goods and people are essential to the ACFTA. So if you are able to incentivize that aspect of the Continental Free Trade Agreement, I think you'll do much better in terms of, because of the way in which there's a disparity of markets are located in Africa. It's not located in big cities only. It's located at cross-border posts. It's located within transitional posts. It's created within particular corridors. And I think we're not recognizing that in terms of we're looking at the big tariff issues, and that will work fine. But I think where the challenge becomes much more difficult to ascertain and what will be the implementation is, what are those sensitive goods that countries like Botswana may not basically will not want to negotiate on? And one of the key areas for Botswana, for example, will be beef. Now, if they have a good relationship with China, given the current tension between Australia and China over their political issues, Botswana could become a very important actor to China for beef exports. Now, how does that create competition in Southern Africa? Can we have a regional agreement around that in terms of agriculture? So I think there's two things we've got to look at in this African Continental Free Trade Agreement. We've got to look at the services, we've got to look at agriculture, and we've got to look at non-agricultural manufacturing agreements. Because again, it's not just about one sector, it is about the intertwining of different sectors in Africa, from agriculture to non-agricultural products, and that's in terms of tariffs, but there's also non-tariff barriers, sanitary and phytosanitary, and that has been a big issue in the WTO, and it's been stalemated in the WTO. That's why the Doha development round hasn't gone forward, because again, there's also the question of bigger countries talking about mega regional blocks. We can't afford this in Africa because we don't have the resources to say, oh, we can come to this at the end of 5 years. I don't think we have the luxury, because again, we may find ourselves in Africa where the global economy has moved into a particular direction, and we're still looking at the economic dimensions in a particular way. And I think we've got to find synergies around particular areas of sensitive industrial spaces and sectors. Then, of course, the industrialization policy. Again, we're talking about competing with each other. If you look at South Africa's automotive sector, and it wants to compete with Morocco, again, there's different dimensions. You've got to look at what is our comparative advantage. So by the time we get to where we are, I think it's going to take us a fair bit, Tariq, before we get to where this African Continental Free Trade Agreement should be on tariffs, should be on non-tariff barriers, should be on sanitary and phytosanitary, and also in terms of how it rationalizes regional blocks versus bilateral agreements versus continental agreements. So I think for me, a lot of this is still very much theoretical. It's still in the making. I think what you see in terms of governments coming together and signing agreements and implementing instruments and domesticating aspects of the Continental Free Trade Agreement around rules of origin in their domestic setting still is a long way in terms of how this is going to play out at the implementation level in terms of on the ground in practice. Because on the ground and in practice, I can't see how people that are at border posts are going to envisage that somebody who's doing cross-border trade is not a migrant and is not an economic refugee, or is not a refugee that's coming into South Africa to take jobs. That for me is the big question around implementation at cross-border posts, at border management issues and agencies like we have in South Africa. And all of this means that it's going to take a while before the policies catch up to people's implementation on the ground. The final point I want to make, and that is having maybe the one incentive around this is for Africa to think about maybe 3 or 4 turnkey areas. So just like how China has the Belt Road Initiative, maybe Africa needs its own Belt Road Initiative, where there's 3 or 4 key areas that are going to shift and push. And this is where NEPAD's infrastructure and PIDA, the Presidential Infrastructure Development Agency and Program, all of these things should be aligned. At the moment, I'm not seeing the alignment. And I think this is where the African Free Trade Agreement could actually be much more for me, I think it'd be much more critical and significant and give you much more value if we actually now start saying that these are the areas around where we see key points around the infrastructure, the macro, the micro and local development.
Arina, recently Pakistan has launched Pakistan's Africa policy to boost trade and enhance economic relations with the African countries. So how would you suggest to Pakistan to implement this policy and to take advantages of opportunities that exist under the African Continental Free Trade Area, Afcfta, for Pakistan?
The Pakistan Engage Africa program, you're starting to see a greater acceleration, particularly towards economic diplomacy in official discourse from Pakistan's side. And with this emphasis on Africa, and held under the government's Engage Africa initiative, Pakistan's heads of missions, in Abuja and Addis Ababa, Algiers, Nairobi, Tripoli, Port Louis, Rabat, Pretoria, Niamey, Khartoum, Dar es Salaam, Dakar, and I think I'm missing a few others. But these heads of missions participated in the meeting, and this is really starting to underline a shift from geopolitics to geoeconomics at the same time, but geopolitics still playing an immense role. So you're starting to see how economic diplomacy is becoming a major driver of engagements with Africa. And in terms of engagement with the Continental Free Trade Area, many countries are actually asking the same question. And in the meantime, in pursuing and strengthening trade relationships on a bilateral and regional basis. So in the bigger picture, African countries want to be able to increase trade meaningfully with the world, especially with South-South cooperation partnerships specifically. But they need to be afforded the opportunity to strengthen this kind of institutional capacity, hopefully further diversify their markets. And so the approach that other countries have taken in the meantime, while the Afcfta takes on a greater dynamic of how it will engage a field once it's ironed out a number of its technicalities and a number of promises that it's already made. What we're seeing is that in the meantime, other countries have said, let us rather pursue and strengthen trade relationships on a bilateral basis to begin with. So I think that is a much more prudent way to approach this, a kind of wait-and-see development. But I think Sanusha may also have much more to add, and just definitely in terms of the geopolitics behind the regional implications as well.
Sanusha, how would you analyze and suggest Pakistan's Africa policy?
Yeah, I think, as Arina has said, I think, Pakistan is joining a list of countries that have turned to Africa for some kind of economic engagement, whether we want to call it an economic diplomacy or we want to call it an economic policy or an engage with Africa policy. So many countries, I mean, in a way, Africa is spoiled for choice right now, because you've got countries that are former colonial actors, from Britain to France to Italy and to Spain, and then you've got the US, who's now be talking about a renewed Africa policy under the Biden administration. You've got China, which is the biggest actor. I think it's actually overtaken the US in terms of trade with Africa. You've got India, which is hot on the heels. You've got Russia, which is now also in the mix. Israel, Gulf states, Turkey. You've got South Korea. I mean, it's just a smorgasbord of countries that are turning to Africa for some kind of engagement. My sense is that it should not be an engagement where you turn to Africa because everybody else is turning to Africa. You've got to have a very clear strategy as to why you're turning to Africa. What is the engagement entailing? What are the key areas and comparative advantages you're going to bring in this engagement? For me, I am more interested in how Africa deals with these lists of actors that are now at their doorstep or inside the continent and have an important footprint, because at the end of the day, it should be Africa dictating the terms of trade. Whilst you want to have a bilateral or a multilateral or a continental agreement with China or India or the USA or the EU, I think it's important for Africa to extract the best possible benefits for its interests and make sure that those benefits are mutually agreed upon. And this is where I would encourage African governments to be much more clearer about the kind of engagement they want with whether it's Pakistan or whether it's India and so forth. The problem here, Tariq, is that we are seeing a resurgence of geopolitical competition and rivalry emerging. It's about, what are other countries doing? Should I now get into the mix in Africa? That is the wrong approach. I think the right approach would be much more for Africa to be more clear about its agency with regard to its engagement. And we do know that the AU has about external partnership. There's a Troika agreement in terms of how you want to deal with external partners. But again, it all comes back to political will, it comes back to leadership, and it comes back to understanding what the continental needs are and not necessarily only looking at at bilateral. So I think there needs to be a nice balance between the multilateral and the bilateral. But unfortunately, I think I would also caution that there's another undercurrent happening in Africa with regard to countries coming from the Gulf states as well as Iran, Turkey, etc. And that is the undercurrent of how Islamic thought and Islamic narratives are being projected on the continent. And that's something that's not in the economic domain, but it has very political explosiveness in terms of areas like West Africa in relation to the two schools of thought around Islamic schools of thought around Islamic consideration and theocracy. And I think it's very challenging in Africa as well. I mean, because these become flashpoints of insecurity, instability, and it becomes critical for the way peace and security is then defined in the continent.
Arina, what are the challenges to African agency through Afcfta? How would you analyze and conclude this?
So, in terms of the existing regional economic communities in Africa, there are 8, and they're recognized by the African Union. And so, in terms of the Continental Free Trade Area, there is a kind of expectation that very quickly it will be able, or will be very clear at least, how these regional economic communities, we call them RECs, will actually integrate and engage on the Afcfta, which is not necessarily the case because the RECs themselves will not fall away. And they will actually exist in a parallel fashion with the Continental Free Trade Area. So again, you're starting to see a stronger bilateral element emerge the Continental Free Trade Area, where if you are outside a particular REC, it does not, and you are wanting to trade with a particular REC, it does not necessarily mean that using the Continental Free Trade Area, you will have some kind of preferential access to the region itself. So here you are starting to see more complexities emerge. In addition to that, I mean, the context in which African countries find themselves at the WTO and the need to rapidly adjust these domestic systems to the needs to the Continental Free Trade Area and the practical and implementable ambitions of African countries themselves, these are the major challenges that are still existing. As we know, WTO rules in history do not make it easier for developing countries, especially in the current context. And we need to move forward immensely with what the Continental Free Trade Area wants to achieve. So there's a lot of work that still needs to be done before we can actually see practicable and favorable results even.
Sanusha, how would you analyze and conclude the challenges to African agency?
I think the first challenge is understanding what leadership means and having consensus. Sometimes we talk about these different instruments or policies, but then there's complete disconnect from what's happening on the ground. I think the big challenge for Africa is having leadership that is able to drive a policy that is is built around consensus. We're not going to achieve complete consensus on anything because there are going to be competing interests, and the complexities that Arina has referred to and the challenges that she has referred to means that every country is going to be driven by their national interest. But it's about how do you define that national interest in terms of what is in the national interest and what can actually have a regional spillover for the national interest. So I think the first point for me is the idea of political leadership, governance, and political will. I think very often we're looking at leaders in the continent that still kind of romanticize the world of economic integration and the kind of Pan-Africanism that we see in Africa that is sometimes disconnected from realities on the ground. The third issue for me would be rationalizing the RECs. I think Arina's right in saying that if we go forward, we're going to see a kind of parallel set of norms, standards, and values that maybe the RECs will start to push forward, and then we'll see the ACFTA. So rationalizing that space will be important, but there's an added complexity to that, and that's something called customs unions. We have a customs union in Southern Africa called the Southern African Customs Union. We have one in East Africa called the East African Customs Union, the EAC, and these customs unions place an added set of complexities onto the way in which regional economic communities operate. So, for example, we've got to rationalize all of this. So in Southern Africa, we've got the South African currency, the rand, but that is used as a monetary currency in terms of the way it's used as a transactional currency. Now, this has implications again. So, we're talking about very complicated and intense instruments around financial integration, around movement of goods. We're talking about all of these things, and these things have to find a sense of solidarity and a sense of complementarity. And right now, I think that when you look at the African Continental Free Trade Agreement, I think it's governments talking to themselves about it. There's very little, I would say, is happening in terms of understanding and unpacking and disaggregating it for the ordinary person on the street. And this is where I think we have to start thinking about that challenge as the fourth challenge for this. So I would conclude and say that it's a beautiful instrument. Theoretically, I think it makes perfect sense. If we don't try it, we'll never know. But again, I think the way to have done it was, instead of going top down, was to actually rationalize from the bottom up.
Arina and Sanusha, thank you so much for your valuable in-depth analysis on African Agency and Afcfta, and thank you so much again.
It was a pleasure.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for approaching.